This week, US and Ukrainian officials meet in Saudi Arabia for talks about Russia's war of invasion of Ukraine. It's probable we won't hear the details of those talks, at least not quickly, but it could go one of two ways. If NBC is right, it might be the moment when the US makes it clear to Ukraine that they will enable Putin to finish the job of taking Ukraine in its entirety unless they capitulate, cede all of the land that's been occupied, maybe more. Oh, and of course sign the minerals deal with the US, possibly a minerals deal that's had the one-sidedness bumped up slightly since the last time it was seen. I mean, that's based on mutterings after the meltdown in the Oval Office, where Trump said that he wanted the deal to be bolstered to Ukraine's disadvantage, partly as a punishment. The alternative version is that the US really is seeking for basic concessions from the Ukrainians while seeking to understand where their red lines are so that they can then project this position into good faith discussions with Russia. The NBC connection is that over the weekend, NBC reported that Trump had made it clear to his aides that merely signing the minerals deal alone wouldn't be enough for the US to restart aid to Ukraine and, crucially, intelligence sharing with Ukraine. That Ukraine had to agree to give up territory before it would get restoration of either of those things. And there's no guarantee that they would get it then, just that that's the minimum precondition. Now, obviously, this would be a transformation in the US role in the negotiations. This wouldn't be the US acting as an honest broker between Russia and Ukraine. This wouldn't be the US using its muscle to persuade the two parties to come to the table. This would be the US having suspended intelligence sharing. As a result, Ukraine having experienced a big increase in Russian attacks upon them, dismissed by Trump over the weekend as what anyone would do in the circumstances. Having done all that, the US would then be using that pressure to force the Ukrainians to accept substantive concessions to their invaders. Forced capitulation to Putin's demands, one of them anyway. This would be the US negotiating on behalf of Putin, not the US acting as a broker, obviously. Now, under that scenario, I would expect the discussions behind closed doors to be a relatively aggressive pitch by the US. Presumably the pitch being something along the lines of give up this land or we enable Putin to go all the way and take the whole country. Oh, and also lose Zelensky because we don't want him in the way. At some point, you have to think that Ukraine would decide that it had nothing left to lose in saying to the Americans, our thanks to your predecessors anyway, for their support, but right now, go to hell. If the scenario is how I describe it there anyway. Ukraine has an interest in that not being the case, so it's going into the Saudi talks with a public stance based on the alternative scenario, that the US is a neutral broker to be negotiated with. It will be a two-way discussion, not a one-way series of demands, and in that scenario, they are going to push for a temporary ceasefire in the sea and for long-range missile strikes, and in return, they would seek the resumption of US support. And they will continue to insist that there need to be security guarantees to prevent another Russian attack. It's impossible at this stage to know if that is a position they hope to win agreement for, or they are simply going in with a version of what has been asked of them in order to flush out whether the Americans are really serious in meeting them halfway. Based on what's been said and done to date, you wouldn't hold out a lot of hope for an agreement on any of those. One factor that may make a difference, which is the growing course of criticism of Trump for being so obviously in line with Putin's Russia. Peter Zion had an interesting turn of phrase for it in his latest video, having gone through the list of all the things the Trump administration was doing that went against its own foreign policy interests. He finished with this statement: this isn't incompetence. This is a deliberate disassembly of American power and safety. And he's just one of many saying such things, particularly in relation to Russia. So maybe that's why Trump randomly tweeted out a slightly half-hearted threat to Russia to hit them with sanctions if they didn't come to the table. Now, the threat itself was inconsequential because they're so heavily sanctioned already. The item that Trump mentioned would have had almost zero impact on them. And he kind of undermined the attempts to answer the criticisms when just a couple of hours later, he was back there telling journalists that Russia was really fine and they had many more problems negotiating with the Ukrainians than the Russians, and so on. But it does raise the question of whether the US in negotiations will feel at least some minimal pressure not to simply go gangbusters for forcing Ukraine into total capitulation. Trump is not immune to public opinion, and the vast majority of the US public in recent polling say that they sympathise with Ukraine, not with Russia. Now, I personally doubt it will make that much difference, and so do many others, but maybe public opinion will become a factor. Personally, I still hold that the majority of players on the international stage are now fully aware that the US is an adversary of Ukraine, don't really expect this to change while Trump is in office, and they are simply trying not to say so while they scramble to cover themselves from the consequences. Whatever else happens, this will play out badly for the US in the medium term, as former allies take steps to make themselves less vulnerable to exactly the pressure Trump is currently applying to Ukraine. It was the suspension of intelligence sharing that really did it, because as we've discussed here before, many US-made weapons become useless without US operational support of one kind or another. Up to this point in time, US weapon manufacturers have dominated as the suppliers of choice to European countries. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute released a report today showing that European arms imports rose by 155% in the last 5 years in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The US manufacturers' share of those weapons purchases went from 52% to 64%. That's likely to change now. European countries are quickly re-evaluating the risk they're exposed to, should the US at future points do to them what Trump is doing now to Ukraine. Now, it doesn't happen quickly. European NATO members currently have almost 500 combat aircraft, many other weapons still on order from the US. Lead times are long. You can't just turn around on a dime and decide to cancel those and buy from elsewhere. But the significant boost to European defence budgets that have now recently been passed are unlikely to see new spending committed to American companies. So, for example, German economists recently warned against buying American F-35 fighter jets. European defence manufacturers have seen their shares prices rise in recent weeks in the expectations they're about to do remarkably well. It's not just weapons, also things like technology. Europe currently has a heavy reliance on US digital infrastructure and services. Its data is largely stored on US cloud services, courtesy of companies like Amazon and Microsoft and Google. Europe accounts for just 10% of the global microchip market. US companies are leading in artificial intelligence by a long way. It used to be that was just taken as a given, accepted, something that you had to say was part of the furniture because of how far ahead they were. But now it's being seen as existential. So European sovereign infrastructure needs to be put in place, the argument goes, to ensure that no external power can just pull the plug on the EU's digital backbone. It's a long way away, and one of the reasons for that has been Europe's traditionally risk-averse bureaucratic approach to technology versus the US's more open and entrepreneurial approach. It's possible that the huge strategic awakening that they've had, seeing how Putin is being empowered by the Trump administration, will lead the EU to overthrow at least the most restrictive aspects of that, necessity being such a tremendous motivator. Another aspect has been the role of Elon Musk and Starlink internet services in Ukraine. Musk's recent sort of tweeted threat that Starlink could be shut down, followed by his total denial that he would ever shut it down. followed by his incredibly arrogant and demeaning comments to the Polish foreign minister, a major Starlink customer, about their funding for the services in Ukraine. Add to that as well, Trump's removing Ukraine's access to satellite photography from another US company, a service that was used to detect enemy troop deployments. This has highlighted the ambitions of free European aerospace companies that want to join up to compete with SpaceX, particularly on low Earth's orbit satellites to be used for commercial telecommunications. If the European regulators can bring themselves to agree to such a merger, there'll be a key test of how serious they are. It's not what European bureaucrats generally like to do. The current anti-competition rulebook would frown on any sort of merger of size. One reason why EU companies have been so far behind traditionally. How quickly can the old European dog learn new tricks? Well, we're going to find out. All of these things will shape the future, regardless of what happens next. It's just going to take time. Changes may be barely noticed day to day, but we will end up in a very different place to the one we might have expected, and it won't be as beneficial to American companies. But all the political leaders concerned are worried that saying any of this out loud will just provoke the beast of Washington, D.C. and lead to some punitive measures aimed specifically at them. So you have Ursula von der Leyen insisting, of course the United States is a trusted ally, and of course there's no need of de-risking with the United States. Although, quote, we see that sovereignty but also ironclad commitments are called into question. And she added, everything has become transactional. Now, okay, she didn't mention Trump by name, so probably she was thinking of someone else entirely. And sure, when she talked about a list of like-minded countries with whom Europe could entertain deeper relationships, she name-checked Canada and Norway and Britain, not the United States, but she probably just forgot, even though journalists repeatedly tried to get her to say whether she considered America to be an ally. Sure, it just slipped her mind. This is the game of the moment, but the US-Ukraine discussions tomorrow may be the beginning of the end for the pretense. If the Ukrainians are confronted with an American position that is literally using all of that muscle on the part of Vladimir Putin, are they really going to sign that minerals deal? Are they really going to keep pretending that the US is the most important ally, that they just need to bend a little bit more at the knee to before they turn around? Oh, and don't forget saying thank you over and over again to the country that is screwing them because it can. In other contexts, Trump may be learning that he might need to adjust his approach. That abusive and derisive stances towards other countries might not be the powerful tool that he imagined to win them round to his way of thinking. So over the weekend, Mark Carney was elected to leadership of the Liberal Party and for a brief time before the election, the Prime Ministership of Canada. Carney's Liberal Party has seen a resurgence in support, thanks to the backlash against Trump's derisive descriptions of Trudeau as the governor of the 51st state of the USA and the imposition of massive tariffs on the country. Carney's winning speech was full of defiance to the Trump assault on his country. Now, it may or it may not be enough to prevent a Conservative win in the coming election. But if it is, there will be no doubt that that will have been down to the Trump effect. Likewise, Greenland, having an election soon, Trump posted this. As I made clear during my joint address to Congress, the United States strongly supports the people of Greenland's right to determine their own future. Yeah, you kind of ruined the moment, though, in that speech, by then adding, I think we're going to get it. One way or the other, we're going to get it. Big knowing laugh at the one way or another line, with memories of Trump having refused to rule out using force to get Greenland. But that was then. Now he was tweeting this. We will continue to keep you safe as we have since World War II. Have they said thank you for that? I mean, today, in the last hour or so, you'd think they would say thank you. We are ready to invest billions of dollars to create new jobs and make you rich, which presumably you'll then recoup at an advantageous markup. I mean, does he not realise that while promises of benefits and security probably would have been the way to go in the first instance, it's kind of too late to do that after you've hinted that you might take their territory by force, and after you've shown astonishing lack of generosity to another country who America spent some time trying to keep safe, only to then specifically and deliberately and arrogantly throw it to the Russian wolf. Still, at least he's now using the language of supporting their right to determine their own future. Might suggest that he's slowly learning the lessons that bullying as a first resort, not well calibrated to getting what you want. I don't imagine he's going to enjoy learning that it's more or less impossible to turn back the clock after you've united an entire country in fear and insult against you. We can only speculate what his plan C will look like once that lesson has sunk in.